Welcome to Once Upon a Train. I'm your conductor, Michael Campbell. Many of the experiences that I've shared here came about because of my relationship with Walt Disney's family. Among the greatest achievements of Walt's daughter, Diane Disney Miller, is the amazing Walt Disney Family Museum here in San Francisco. How I came to know Diane and witness the genesis and fruition of her dream is explored in this episode. It's important that I do not overstate my role in the creation of this museum. If you think of the Passion Project as Diane writing and conducting a grand symphony, I'm just the guy in the back with the triangle. But I was there since the idea first took root more than 25 years ago. I have seen it grow and blossom through its evolution, realization, and operation since. It is a privilege to share my small part in that story with you. By the way, if Once Upon a Train were all about clicks, I would call this episode Secrets of the Walt Disney Family Museum. Number 8 will shock you. But it isn't, and I didn't. We've got a clean stack and clear track, so welcome aboard.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Once Upon a Train.
I met Diane Disney Miller and her family a few weeks before the opening of Walt Disney's Carolwood Barn in Griffith Park in 1999. I've never been known for being shy, so I spoke with her about some different ideas I had. In another episode, I recount how I suggested a G-gauge model of the Lilybell engine and how much she hated that idea. Notwithstanding, though, we just kind of hit it off, having some interests and a sense of humor in common. Much of her dad's stuff was in a storage facility near Walt Disney Imagineering in Glendale. I went there to help retrieve items related to the Carolwood Pacific Railroad for display in the barn. I was stunned by what awaited us there. Train cars, of course, but also countless awards and citations, personal mementos, even taxidermy mounts that were intended to be used to Club 33. It would not have surprised me to find the Ark of the Covenant in there. But none of the items were presented as priceless artifacts. Indeed, apart from a beautiful Italian donkey cart, the boxes and bins looked as they might have belonged to anyone's family. As we went through it, Diane remarked that these items had been tucked away for so long that my grandkids haven't even seen these, and she thought maybe it was time to get some of it out of storage. A few of these precious items had made their way to the offices of Retlaw Enterprises, the family's personal company. On a visit there to take measurements of the Lilybell 2, I saw Christopher Miller's Autopia car, ceramic tiles crafted by Mary Blair, Walt's handmade steamboat and stagecoach models, and an original Fort Wilderness Railroad lithograph. The offices, though nice, were far too small to display more than a handful of artifacts, and not suited for many visitors. For her dad's 100th birthday, Diane staged an exhibition about his life at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. Entitled Walt Disney, the Man and His Magic, it showcased more of her father's collection and was strongly received by the public. The original Lilybell and caboose were retrieved from Disneyland's Main Street station to display at the exhibition, along with other Carolwood cars. Diane decided that Disneyland has had Dad's train long enough, so the Lilybell 2 took the original's place at the park, where it remains today. Following the Reagan exhibition, Diane decided that I'm going to get a little place to display all of Dad's stuff. This was about the time that the Presidi-go transitioned from the Army to a historic trust, thereby making parts of it available for commercial use. Diane obtained one of the former Army warehouses that was close to the world-famous Palace of Fine Arts and also near a home that she and her husband Ron had in San Francisco. This humble space provided room to display many of the items, awards, and memorabilia Walt and Lily Disney were given or had acquired. Custom display cases proudly presented some of the 26 Academy Awards he won, along with the Presidential Medal of Freedom awarded to him by President Lyndon Johnson. Of course, the Lily Bell and her train would hold a prominent place. It was during the setup of that train that I asked Diane if she would consider loaning it to me. The California State Railroad Museum is among the finest museums in the country. I thought it could provide an excellent setting for an exhibition celebrating Walt's love of railroading, with the Lily Bell as the highlight. Diane was delighted with the concept. She and Ron made a generous donation to the museum to fund that exhibition, which I named The Happiest Train on Earth, Walt Disney's Backyard Railroad. This meant, of course, transporting the Carolwood Pacific train from San Francisco to Sacramento. This was in 2002, well before any professional conservationists were involved in the family's collection. A few pieces of equipment had custom-made crates that were used in previous moves. The rest didn't, so in a scenario that would give museum professionals the shudders, we wrapped up the cars in moving blankets and placed them in minivans and SUVs for the trip. All of it arrived without a scratch. The train was to be displayed on a trestle custom built for this purpose. Unfortunately, the trestle came with neither instructions nor its builder, Roger Brody Jr. It took a while for us to determine how to assemble it, and then we placed the Lily Bell and equipment thereon. The show was a huge success. The California State Railroad Museum estimated an increase of 400,000 visitors during the exhibition's run. We safely returned Walt's train and other artifacts to the family's private display on Gorgas Avenue in the Presidio, again in the back of cars, and I thought that was the end of that. I could not have been more wrong. In 2006, the Richard M. Nixon Presidential Library staged a holiday exhibition of model trains. The former president was a rail fan and a friend of Walt Disney, so it wasn't surprising when they asked Diane to loan the Lily Bell and some cars to support the show. At this point, Ron and Diane had hired conservators to manage their collection. However, they asked me to supervise the transport and setup of the train, as I had experience doing so. And I also knew how to take apart and assemble Roger Jr.'s trestle. Gone were the shipping blankets and prayers, because professional movers packed and conveyed the equipment to the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda. I put together a small volunteer group to help with the display. We treated each piece as if it were a Fabergé egg. This gave us the opportunity to take hundreds of detailed photos that would otherwise be difficult, if not impossible, to do. For example, you've heard of the backside of water. I now present the underside of caboose. Once again, all the items were safely returned to the Presidio, and I again thought, well, that was that. It wasn't. During this time, the family's collection had grown through donations, such as an original Kem Weber animator's desk and a Walt Disney Studios optical printer. Also growing was awareness of this private museum and interest in visiting it. I imagine that this, in addition to the great public reaction to the exhibitions at presidential libraries and the California State Railroad Museum, encouraged Diane that there could be a place for people to learn about her father, who was a real person and not just a corporate symbol. She said that she was thinking of setting up an animation research library, maybe taking school groups through, and so on. Diane asked for my feedback on some concept designs for making the warehouse more visitor-friendly, with a small reception desk, an audio tour, and more. It was tasteful and whimsical, but the facility itself was just too small to properly present everything she wanted to. Diane and her family's vision kept growing, so just like the little park by the studio would grow into Disneyland. It was the late, great Imagineer Bruce Gordon who said to Diane, "Your dad had one of the biggest lives ever. Doesn't it deserve a big museum to tell that story?" Diane and Ron acquired one of the Presidi-go's former army barracks on the parade grounds to serve as the home of the Walt Disney Family Museum. These buildings date back to just after the Civil War. They survived the 1906 earthquake, but were in need of repair and modernization. Additionally, 50,000 square feet still wasn't enough space for all of Walt's artifacts and stories. This giant brick building was essentially lifted up so that 2 basements, one including a large raked theater, could be constructed. The original building was essentially a U-shape. Exhibit space and guest flow required that the open courtyard had to be filled in. Bruce Gordon, who became the museum's show producer, came up with the idea to create a large S-ramp to gently take visitors from the second floor of Gallery 9 down to the first. This walkway also created many perspectives from which to observe Walt's creative explosion during the 1950s, all the way from the Carolwood Pacific through television programs, the making of Disneyland, the 1960 Winter Olympics, Mary Poppins, and the concepts for Epcot. Diane and her son, Walter Miller, hired me to serve as a railroad consultant, or as Diane put it, my train guy. I supervised the creation of all the railroad-related exhibits and performed extensive research to ensure that everything presented was factually correct. During an early planning session at the Gorgas location, Diane got all excited and said, "Oh, it's here!" We all went outside, and upon a flatbed truck was a genuine World War I era Red Cross ambulance, just like the one that Walt drove, fully restored. For some reason, the delivery driver couldn't unload the ambulance, so we all pitched in to do so. Walter steered, his dad, Ron, pulled. Diane watched from the sides to ensure the vehicle didn't hit the door frame. Ron looked at me and said, "Hey, you're our consultant. Go consult at the front end." So I pushed from the radiator. Diane was so excited to have the ambulance. She was giddy like a kid on Christmas morning. This was typical of her boundless enthusiasm for every aspect of the museum. She absolutely loved taking the press and other visitors through the building at various stages, telling folks what would go where, how it would look and make people feel, and so on. Her joy was palpable and infectious. I never met her dad, but I've heard from many direct sources that he had the same childlike enthusiasm when describing in vivid detail something that the studio, or WED, were going to create. Trains were important to Walt through his entire life. From Marceline, where his Uncle Mike was an engineer on the Santa Fe, to Kansas City and Walt's job as a newsbutch, through a cross-country trip where Mickey Mouse was born, out to Holmby Hills and his miniature live-steam Carolwood Pacific Railroad, and on to Anaheim, where Walt, a kid who once received only some paper and a pencil as his only Christmas present, owned 5 railroads. Naturally, his family wanted all these and more represented in the museum. Walt's childhood is explored in Gallery 1. The concept was to display running HO-scale model trains from that era. These would appear underneath the monitors where Walt described what it was like growing up in the Midwest. In my research, I learned that some historical organizations have preserved a great number of records from the Santa Fe and Missouri Pacific Railroads. With their support, I was able to identify the specific locomotives and cars that were in service when Walt saw them as a kid and later, as a teen, worked on. I acquired accurate models of both trains and had master modelers letter, number, and weather these to make them as accurate as possible. The models were then mounted on an armature system that allowed them to run across the display track and loop underneath to then magically reappear at the far end. The mechanisms worked beautifully, except in one aspect. They were loud. Very loud. So loud that it drowned out Walt's narration. Additional soundproofing insulation didn't reduce the noise enough, so the models were parked in the display windows and the motors unplugged. One of the most spectacular objects at the museum is Walt's Carolwood Pacific train. It makes a dramatic statement as visitors enter Gallery 9. The Lilybell leads her freight train up a curved cantilevered bridge that is 15 feet above the ground floor. That placement meant that removing any part of the train would be a big challenge. Therefore, all preservation work had to be fully complete before it was mounted on the bridge. There were two major schools of thought regarding museum artifacts. The first is that the object should be cleaned and any noticeable damage repaired. The second is to leave the item as is, preserved but not restored, because all wear and tear are part of the artifact's story. This latter philosophy is why the Star-Spangled Banner is displayed with an odd V piece of red fabric on a white stripe. It's not original, but it is preserved as part of the flag's history. The Lilybell locomotive suffered a fair amount of damage in the post-Walt years due to poor handling. Fenders were bent, a window pane cracked, and someone had secured the hinged wooden cab roof, handmade by Walt, by driving 4 mismatched screws through it and into the cab walls, thereby splitting the wood. It seemed to me that these imperfections should be fixed before display. Some of the museum staff felt that this damage is part of the locomotive's story and should be left alone. The final decision, of course, was Diane's to make. We presented the two options to her, and she could see the logic behind each position. She wasn't sure which way to go, so I mentioned that out of all the myriad of things that her dad created, he only named one after her mom. It just didn't seem right to showcase it with these flaws. Diane still wasn't certain, so I went way out on a limb and said that this is one of the rare instances where we know what Walt would have done. This immediately got the "oh, really?" raised eyebrow reaction that Diane would give anyone who said Walt would have done whatever. Her father's actions were notoriously hard to predict, even by his family and people who had worked for him for decades. Diane did not suffer fools gladly, and I could tell I was dangerously close to the red zone. So I showed her the "I Have Always Loved Trains" article written by Walt in 1965. He says, in the final paragraph, "What happened to the Carolwood Pacific train? I still have it. I'm going to get it repainted and displayed in a glass case at the Disneyland and Santa Fe station." This quote shows that he knew the engine needed to be fixed up before being put on display. That was all Diane needed to know in order to choose the cosmetic restoration. Fortunately, we had the help of two talented individuals who could do this work without erasing Walt's fingerprints. Tanya Morris was the museum's conservator and did an absolutely brilliant job with the cab. It is impossible to determine where it was damaged even under close inspection. Sean Batista is the owner of Hillcrest Shops, where his team has done a complete restoration of Disneyland Railroad's C.K. Holiday and Ernest S. Marsh locomotives. His commitment to engineering excellence is well known, and I felt, because I knew him personally, that he was the perfect person to repair the broken and bent mechanical parts. We also used a borescope to inspect the smoke box and boiler for any hidden signs of rust. The headlamp, handcrafted by Walt, was at one time affixed to a bracket, but the screws that did so had long since disappeared. I went through my own workshop and found two perfectly sized replacements that I then used to securely attach the headlamp. You can now truthfully say you know the guy who screwed up the Lily Bell. The Carolwood train was one of the final artifacts to be installed at the museum. We took the Lily Bell from the Gorgas warehouse on a specially made rolling platform, making it look like the world's coolest pull toy. I took this photo as it moved through Gallery 8 because of the stunning view of the Golden Gate. As mentioned, the display bridge is cantilevered from a brick wall that used to frame the courtyard. There is no physical connection between it and the gallery's S-curved ramp. If you're at the museum, look up at the ceiling when standing in front of the Carolwood Pacific train. You'll see an I-beam that doesn't seem to serve any purpose. However, it once did. It was used to move the Lily Bell from the ramp to the display track. The rolling wood platform was made so that the locomotive could simply roll from it onto the track, and it worked just as intended. However, when we then attempted to roll the engine up into position, she derailed. Thinking it was just the way we were handling it, we put her back on the track, moved it uphill, and again it derailed. I asked for a tape measure and found that the company who built the display didn't quite follow my specifications. The Carolwood Pacific Railroad was built to a precise gauge of 7 1/4 inches between the rails. The display track's gauge ranged from 6 inches to more than 8 inches over its length. We had to stop the installation so that the track could be re-gauged to the correct size. Afterwards, the Lily Bell glided perfectly into position, as did all of the freight cars. The train couldn't be complete without Walt's yellow caboose. Much of the Carolwood rolling stock was made by the Studio Machine Shop. Apart from the wheels and frame, Walt handcrafted the entire caboose, and he was justifiably proud of it. The difference between a priceless artifact and a pile of kindling is a single oops. No one took a breath as the installation crew carefully lifted the caboose across the chasm and onto its new home. The flags on 19th century steam locomotives were typically green or white, depending on the train's schedule. However, Walt displayed his patriotism by often placing small American flags at the front of his steam engine when it was posed for publicity photos and filming. Those original flags vanished many years ago. I felt it was important to carry forward his tradition, and so I asked Michael Aronson to print miniature 48-star flags on fabric so that visitors would see the Lily Bell precisely as Walt intended. Directly above the Carolwood train is a 3D topographical map of the Carolwood estate. It features an accurate recreation of the railroad's route and even has a tiny train that can move around the track. The display is mounted vertically, requiring the train to be attached to an armature and propelled by a chain drive. As with Gallery 1, the motor proved to be too loud for the exhibit, and it too remains turned off. Very likely, the most memorable exhibit in the museum is the Disneyland of Walt's imagination. This is not Disneyland as it was built, but rather the way Walt thought it might look. For example, Space Mountain was constructed a decade after Walt's passing. The version here is based on John Hench's original concept art that Walt saw and approved, including the rockets flying outside the mountain. Diane and Walter hired Kerner Optical, the spin-off of Industrial Light and Magic's practical effects team, to create this vast, super detailed model. An operating Santa Fe and Disneyland Railroad was part of her vision. Indeed, part of the reason the overall model is a particular size was so that we could run N-gauge model trains on it. I recruited master modeler Kermit Paul to design and build the control system for this railroad. It is spectacular. The trains slow and stop at the stations. The semaphore signals change color, and then the train slowly accelerates up to speed, just like it is at the park. Kermit's planning was outstanding. And yet, the train doesn't run. Why? N-scale trains are known for being sensitive to imperfections in physical track, and any dust on the rails can affect the electrical current that makes them run. The Disneyland model, an undisputed masterpiece, is not positioned in an area where typical track maintenance and re-railing can be easily performed. We upgraded the miniature locomotive's engine. We made a heavy diesel engine to perform track cleaning and more. But in the end, keeping the model Santa Fe and Disneyland train running was deemed impractical, so it was turned off. Someday, I hope the technology improves, where the little train can once again make grand circle tours of the Disneyland of Walt's imagination.
I have no regrets. I find they serve no purpose at all. Yet I admit I am a little disappointed that none of the trains that Diane wanted running in the museum actually run. This is a problem that I vowed not to repeat when I curated the All Aboard, a celebration of Walt's trains exhibition for the museum in 2014. But that's a story for another episode.
The first D23 Expo was held at the Anaheim Convention Center in September 2009. As the museum would open just a few weeks later on October the 1st, there was a desire to have the WDFM represented at the expo. However, all the staff were focused on getting the museum ready, and they had no one to spare to work the convention. Walter Miller asked me if I'd drive the booth equipment down to Anaheim, set it up, and represent the museum for the 3 days of D23. I was greatly flattered and happily agreed. By the end of the third 10-hour, no-break stay, I could barely speak and wasn't so much flattered as flattened. My voice might have been spared if I had made a simple sign with just 3 answers. 1. October the 1st. 2. Because Diane lives in San Francisco. 3. No, he's not. Upon returning the equipment to the Presidi-go, I thought that would be the end of my involvement with the museum. At this point, you can probably guess that it wasn't a matter of if I was wrong, but by how much. The museum opens on schedule and is a success. However, just like her dad's involvement with Disneyland, Diane kept looking for ways to plus it and make little improvements throughout. One of these is the reading rail that's mounted to the ramp in front of the Carolwood Pacific train. Some of the text was incorrect, and some of the displayed artifacts had only tangential ties to Walt. In September 2011, Diane and I collaborated on redoing the entire rail. We rewrote the text, traded out some artifacts, and gave Walt's words a stronger presence.
I didn't know it then, but that would be the last time I directly worked with Diane. She unexpectedly passed away in 2013, about a month shy of her 80th birthday. Diane was so energetic, creative, and sharp. I figured she'd have a very long life, like her mother, who lived to be 98. I'm occasionally asked how I ended up working with Walt Disney's family, and specifically Diane. As I mentioned earlier, we just kind of hit it off. We'd occasionally chat by phone, email about cooking, classes she was taking, wine, of course, places we visited, good restaurants, and so on. Part of this is because Diane was just down to earth, very easy to engage. She never put on airs. Another part of it was a conscious effort by me. The first time we met, someone asked her what her dad would have thought about something. And she gave her standard response of, "I don't know." However, afterwards, almost to herself, I noticed she said, "Nobody ever asked me what I think." It occurred to me then, she didn't sign up to be Walt Disney's daughter and spokesperson. She just didn't have much choice in the matter. I wondered if Diane Disney would have just preferred to be Diane. I made a decision at that point to engage with her, just like that, just as Diane. This is why there are no posed photos of us. I never asked for her autograph. I certainly never asked what her dad would have thought about anything. I met with her one day to discuss an idea I had. I don't remember what it's about other than being train related. I do remember getting rather excited and animated when describing it. When I finished, she gave me a kind of an intense look, and after a beat said, "You would have gotten along with Dad." She did not say, "Dad would have thought such and such about you." Instead, she was talking about my passion for this particular topic. She had the same expression on her face that she has in that film where she's looking at her dad surfing on a boxcar at the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad, and Walt saying, she's thinking Dad's up to it again. I consider her comment to be among the nicest things that's ever been said to me, but I'm convinced she did not mean it as a compliment.
During construction, I learned the plan to use the Presidi-go's former gymnasium as an exhibition space. I pitched the idea to Diane and Walter of using it for an in-depth exploration of Walt's love of trains. They liked the idea, but they were focused on just getting the museum open. After that, the museum scheduled exhibitions about the making of Snow White, the Seven Dwarfs, Mary Blair, and a few others. A space opened up in the schedule for a Walt Disney's Train show in 2014.
This book is an updated and greatly expanded version of the catalog that we created for that exhibition. We used this opportunity to dive deeper into the stories, learn more about the people, and show more objects than we possibly could have done in the exhibition. The story of how that exhibition and this book came together is so detailed and interesting that it's the subject of its own Once Upon a Train episode.
I will let you in on 3 tidbits here. First, as we designed the book's cover, I wanted to use this specific font and this specific locomotive silhouette. Why? Because the original artist of both is Walter Elias Disney. Yes, even though Walt didn't invent much time in creating art after the early days of the studio, he did personally design the Carrollwood Pacific logo, which was then made into a fancier version by studio draftsman Eddie Sargent. Michael Aronson adapted the font and the silhouette for our use. By doing so, Walt inadvertently had a hand in the creation of a book about railroading's influence on his life and work. Secondly, Walt, like all good railroaders, had a pocket watch. His is displayed in his keepsake box in Gallery 9, where it has rested since the museum opened in 2009. You can also see it on page 171 of the excellent book Walt Disney's Treasures, written by his grandson, Walter E.D. Miller. In neither place, though, can you see the watch's engraved back. But I did, way back in the storage unit days and then later at the Gorgas warehouse. Can't quite make it out? Then look at this one. It's identical in every way to Walt's. The movement was made by the American Waltham Watch Company in 1894 and was placed in a case crafted by the Fahey's Watch Case Company. The case's engraving was done by hand and was produced for only a few months also in 1894. The only difference between this watch and Walt's is that his is clearly well used, as you'd expect of a true railroader. Finally, at the end of the 2014 exhibition, I again thought, okay, that's done. You know where this is going. In 2018, Ron Miller recalled the train show and suggested that we put it on again at the Napa Valley Museum, Yountville, of which he was a patron. Next thing you know, I'm knees deep in curating another exhibition. I have finally learned to never say, well, that was that, because just like the Disneyland Railroad, it always comes back. By the way, there's an odd phenomenon that occurs when I stand around the Miller Men. A sinkhole opens up underneath me. Weird.
If you've not yet explored the Walt Disney Family Museum, do yourself a favor and go. I've simply hummed a few notes from Diane and her family's magnum opus. You deserve to experience the entire symphony for yourself. Find out how at waltdisney.org. Thank you to Walter Miller and his entire family, Michael Aronson, Kirsten Komorowski, Caitlin Moneypenny Johnston, and countless others for their kind support of my work with the museum and with this episode. Until next time, happy rails.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this grand circle tour on Once Upon a Train. For your convenience, the like and subscribe buttons will remain open for at least one additional hour. Thank you.